Welcome to Joint Session Diverse Voices in New York State Cannabis, the podcast where policymakers, legislators, thought leaders, licensees, and advocates come to discuss the evolving landscape of cannabis in New York and beyond. I'm Herb Barbot, former Director of Operations at New York's Office of Cannabis Management. Each episode, we bring you in-depth conversations with key voices shaping policy, business, and advocacy, plus expert insights on the latest developments impacting the industry. And now for the episode. Welcome to episode 7 of season 2 of Joint Session. This is Herb Barbot, and in this episode we'll speak with Brian Farmer, former Deputy Director of Compliance at the New York State Office of Cannabis Management and co-founder of the Cannabis Conservancy. But first, as always, let's take a spin around this week's news. In Missouri, the Division of Cannabis Regulation announced last week that it has revoked 25 microbusiness licenses. In October, DCR warned 32 microbusiness licensees that they needed to prove they actually met the requirements for the license type, which, as the DCR stated, is meant to provide an opportunity for cannabis facility ownership to individuals who might not otherwise easily access that opportunity. Requirements include, for example, that the majority owners must meet at least one eligibility qualification, such as having a net worth of less than $250,000 or being a veteran with a service-connected disability. After DCR issued those notices of pending revocation, 7 entities proved their eligibility. 24 licenses were revoked for failure to demonstrate that the microbusiness licenses were majority owned and operated by eligible individuals, and 1 license was revoked for a disqualifying felony offense. This isn't the first time DCR has revoked licenses due to misrepresentation. In March of 2024, DCR revoked 8 licenses for numerous violations, including providing false or misleading information in the application and failure to demonstrate that the microbusiness licenses were majority owned and operated by eligible individuals. Further, DCR said at the time, throughout the application and verification process of the 8 revoked licenses, the purported majority owners had limited to no knowledge or understanding of agreements or operations of the license, and in some cases did not know the person who applied for the license on their behalf. In Pennsylvania, Representatives Emily Kincaid and Abby Major, a Democrat and a Republican respectively, announced in a co-sponsorship memo this week that they plan to introduce a bipartisan adult use bill this session. This is the second bipartisan adult use plan announced via co-sponsorship memo this year. Governor Josh Shapiro used his budget this year to urge lawmakers to send an adult use bill to his desk. His budget envisions a 20% tax on cannabis, which has already been called out for being too high. Kincaid and Major's plan is silent on the cannabis tax rate. This bill is not just about legalization, it's about setting up a stable, well-regulated market that prioritizes public safety and public health, protects children from exposure, promotes social justice, and forces economic opportunity, the lawmakers wrote. The bill will create pathways to expungement, would support investments in communities disproportionately impacted by the failed war on drugs, and would explicitly protect the ability of workers in the industry to unionize. The National Association of Realtors was out this week with a new report on how the legalization of cannabis continues to impact the real estate industry. The report, which was compiled after NAR surveyed over 2,500 of its members, looks at residential real estate, commercial real estate, and perception of crime, among other things. With residential real estate, respondents found no noticeable change in residential property values near dispensaries. The survey even asked about grow houses and found that 20% of members in states where adult use was legal for at least 5 years has sold a grow house in the past. With commercial real estate, nearly half of respondents in adult use states reported an increase in demand for commercial spaces, with this increasing over time. Also, most respondents said that commercial property values near cannabis shops saw no change in value. Finally, nearly half of respondents said there is no change in the perception of crime near cannabis shops. In New York, Hybrid NYC, an adult use retailer that operates as Gotham, is suing the New York State Office of Cannabis Management over a provision in the state's adult use law that requires licensees to have labor peace agreements that, in short, prevent employers from meddling in workers' efforts to organize. Hybrid argues in its complaint filed this week in U.S. District Court for the Southern District of New York that the labor requirement is in conflict with the National Labor Relations Act, the Controlled Substances Act, and the U.S. Constitution. More specifically, it has resulted in Local 338, RWD, SU, UFCW being one of the only, if not the only, labor union that meets this standard, thus further limiting the ability of cannabis license holders to meaningfully negotiate. So, left with little choice, Hybrid accordingly executed an LPA with Local 338, the complaint continues. New York is not alone in adult use states requiring such labor peace agreements. In November, voters in Oregon passed a measure at the ballot box that requires certain cannabis employers to remain neutral when labor organizations communicate with employees about collective bargaining rights. Other states like California and New Jersey also require these agreements. As always, thanks to Cannabis Wire for that news. Check out Cannabis Wire at cannabiswire.com. I'd like to welcome Brian Farmer to Joint Session. Welcome, Brian.
Hey, Herb. How's it going?
Good. Now, typically I do sort of an official, sort of introduction, but in this case, I'd like to just tell a little story. When I was at OCM and we were looking to hire someone to head our compliance unit, my biggest concern was that we'd find people that were knowledgeable in the industry, that we wouldn't be outgunned by the industry. So I was really afraid of that. Then Axel Burnaby, the chief of staff, and I interviewed Brian Farmer, and we were blown away. There were questions that we asked that Brian had been giving deep thought to for a number of years. So we loved them. As the week went on, then we were sort of rethinking, was he really that good? Was he bullshitting us a little bit? So we scheduled a second call, and he blew us away again. And it was one of the best decisions that we made was to hire Brian Farmer. So Brian, can you just talk to us a little bit and tell us some of the highlights of the work that you did at OCM?
Well, thanks, Herb. Appreciate that. That was a very interesting interview process. So you guys convinced me to come work on this project that I think ultimately is one of the most forward-thinking approaches so far in this country, at least, to legalizing cannabis. And there's a lot to say about that, which we'll probably get into here. But I think what I was able to bring, and maybe some of the highlights, were a real world experience with agriculture through my own endeavors as a grower, but also working with cannabis growers in different parts of the country, particularly California, working on certification standards around sustainability with them. Seeing a lot of the struggles and successes that folks were having around the country, and how that might play into what was happening in New York. So I was hoping to bring some of that experience in cannabis, but more broadly, regenerative and organic agriculture, to whatever the construct was going to be in New York. So I think there's a number of things to this point, and I will say that 3 years in, I still think the industry, if we want to call it that, is still in its infancy. New York has a really long way to go to develop a mature market. I would say that about basically the whole country. Things have been so up and down in many places. So I think some of the highlights for me have been working with the social and economic equity team, and working with a group of young people. I will say that because I was always the old guy in the room, super dedicated to the whole proposition of what's in the MRTA, even though some of that was vaguely written, taking the ball and running with that in a way that no other state has. And that's borne out, statistically, in terms of the number of businesses that are owned by people who would never have gotten into the industry in other states in terms of the way those were set up. So that's definitely a highlight. A lot of struggles with that because in New York, I kind of writ large what we're facing with the MRTA and then writing the regs, which we are all involved with, is creating a new paradigm in terms of the way business was going to work. And that kind of hit head on with existing kind of business as usual, especially in the cannabis world, ways of doing business. So I would say that to me there's a lot of nuances there, but that is the big highlight for me, is knowing that I had some part in that.
Well, again, I don't know that many people can appreciate how difficult it is to have an environmentally sound and sustainable industry in cannabis. Can you talk about what some of the concerns are generally?
Yeah, well, generally, and there's a lot of background here, but the big concern is the tendency to, especially in the heavily financed corporate part of cannabis, to grow indoors, which is intensive in terms of energy inputs like fertilizers and other kinds of things. It's resource intensive to an insane degree, and there's lots of studies around what that impact is. So the concern going in and writing regulations for New York was to take that into account. But further, what's in MRTA actually, which isn't in any other, state laws in this country, is actual language around sustainable practices, regenerative agriculture. There's a number of things that are there that we had to flesh out in certain ways. So that, that's something New York was able to do based on those concerns around production techniques. And New York has, and I actually wrote these down, so if people want to go reference this later, there's specific sections in MRTA that relate to all of these things around, it's kind of sections 87 through 94, which is environmental impact. So, businesses have to describe how their business, not just cultivation, but others, are going to impact the environment. There's specifics around sustainable practices, which we tried to get into the actual regulations around production techniques, regenerative practices, things like that. Energy efficiency is a big one, and it took a long time to really parse out all the details of that. We did learn from what other states have done, including Massachusetts, which has been very progressive. We worked with Resource Innovation Institute ultimately to create or work with them on using a tool that they've developed, really cannabis specific for each state, called Power Score. And each business, each cultivator will have to use Power Score to upload their energy information, so that each cultivator's footprint in terms of energy use and some other resource use, water and other things, will be tracked. And other states have done this, but they haven't really used the information in a way that advances the industry. And the hope was that by tracking all of this, and then over a couple of years being able to show how different methodologies play out in terms of resource use, that piece is really important. And further, there's other very specific language around the type of equipment that can be used, the energy efficiency of all of that. So there's that, waste recycling, water use, environmental impact in general, and community impact, because how a business does what it does affects not just there's not just an environmental impact, but it's in the environment, in a bigger sense, which is the community that these businesses operate in. So that is something that businesses also have to work with the state on defining. And then there's lots of, language around compliance, related to all of these things. So it sounds like a big pile of regulations that growers have to follow. But in fact, in agriculture generally, the trend is, especially from the world I come from in certification, internationally, good agricultural practices and the kinds of things that are used to certify farms now are all a part of this. This is not something new and onerous. This is something that, the growers can actually use to improve what they do.
Now, you mentioned the large growers. What about the smaller growers, the legacy farmers? How have they been able to adapt to these regulations?
Well, that is still a work in progress. I'm still in contact with a lot of these folks, and there's a couple of things. One is that even if folks who have been growing for decades are great at what they do, the former kind of legal construct didn't make it easy for them in many ways. And one of the strategies was not to keep records about anything that you did. Everything was in your head, and that was transferred to, your partners that you worked with and all of that. So the practices and strategies around record keeping, which are required in a highly regulated space, are something that's new and honestly a struggle for a lot of people, and they've expressed that to me. So a lot of my work with social and economic equity was working with people via webinars and other kinds of resources to get them up to speed on what was required, strategies for how to do that. So a lot of it is on the technical record keeping side. There are amazing growers using all different kinds of techniques. Most of the legacy folks that are the tier one and micro business folks that are coming in still grow indoors, and came up in that system for all the reasons we know they had to. Growing outside for a lot of people just was not an option. So there's that whole shift around I would say kind of the technical issues in the regulated space. So I think that's probably the biggest struggle. In addition to being many times underfunded for what folks want to do, and ultimately, I would say figuring out long-term strategies for staying viable.
Well, that was my next question: is the balance between the sustainability regulations with sort of ensuring that the growers could be economically viable.
Yeah, I mean, in agriculture, there's always kind of that argument, and it's kind of a false dichotomy. A lot of those things that are required, actually, as I was saying, will in the long term help you be a more efficient grower. And as the market matures, just like any agricultural market, the more efficient you can be with your resources, lower your inputs, your input costs, all those kinds of things, your profit at the end of the whole process is going to be greater. So I would say it might be a little painful to kind of shift your techniques in a way, but down the road, it's going to really pay off to be more efficient and have more of a handle on what you're doing. One of the reasons people could get away with quite inefficient resource use and using expensive inputs and other kinds of things all these years is that the premium in the unlicensed market was very high. Your value add was super high. And it's a question I always throw out to, guys my age who've been doing this for decades. It's like, well, what is a pound of like very handcrafted, be it indoor, outdoor cannabis worth in an agricultural marketplace when you take away that whole premium that people paid for the risk you took. Take away that risk. You're in a legal environment. Okay, what's the equation now? How do you work with that? So being very, efficient, paying attention to those record keeping and regulatory pieces that actually might help you down the road is super important to that long-term viability. So,
Well, you take away the risk, which should lower the cost, but then you're adding in now compliance.
Yes. That's the other big equation, and I actually want to see some folks do some work with the numbers on this. I think it actually, in some instances, comes out about the same. That risk you got rid of is replaced, as you say, by very high taxes, and we could talk about that in another context maybe, but generally the way cannabis is taxed bears no relation to either its risk or its its worth as a crop. Ultimately, it's very overtaxed, and it's the goals, like in New York, the goals around what that tax money is going to be used for are fantastic. And we're seeing that money flow back into the communities now, finally. But, to put all of those goals and the resources that are going to go to those, to put those on the back of growers and businesses that are struggling to get going is rough. And it's something that, regulators and politicians don't really want to look at, because they're, even the folks who have tried to be fairly well informed are still not getting how much of a struggle it is to make these businesses viable with that heavy burden.
Yeah. Now you worked around the country. How did New York's approach to state sustainability compare to other mature markets like California, Washington, Oregon, Colorado?
Well, I think in terms of the actual language that's in the regulations, it has built and taken lessons from the other states, Massachusetts and California in particular. To some extent, Colorado, they've been learning slowly. They've had to work with a lot of their power grid is fairly dirty, so they've put in a lot of incentives for tax, for some of the money that flows out of the system to go back into energy efficiency for growers, which no other state has done. I'd love to see New York do that. California has built in tight regulations, so outdoor growers didn't just have to deal with a couple of state agencies. They also had to do with county environment, fish and wildlife, and several other, and the water boards for each county. So there was stacked up kind of regulatory pieces that those growers had to deal with, and that was onerous. So the result of that has been that a lot of growers have either gotten out of it in California or have kind of slid back over into the unlicensed territory, because the burden was too high. They just couldn't make it work in the legal space. And some do both. So I think New York is probably technically at the forefront in terms of what's being required. And I think we have an opportunity to keep incentivizing people through a number of different methods to push that even more.
Yeah. Now, how can sustainability practices or policies be designed to support, social equity farmers, small farmers? Is it just creating another barrier to entry?
Well, I don't think so. And I want to set a little context too, because of the way that I've started to talk about this in a little bit different way. Part of what sustainability is one of those terms that's kind of started to drift into the meaningless land, because you really got to get specific about the structures that are driving the economy. Those same kinds of kind of extractive business models that don't work for those communities that you mentioned also don't work for the environment. Extractive models kind of are just profit driven. So all of the other kinds of considerations fall to the side. So what the way we're talking about sustainability is kind of chipping away a bit at the edges of a business as usual model. What we need to be talking about is kind of a wholesale shift. And this is actually starting to happen in those communities that have been disadvantaged in so many ways and the target of war on drugs. What people are understanding is that unless you change the economic construct for these businesses, they're going to be playing in the same kind of business as usual environment. So people are getting interested in cooperatively owned businesses, collectives, other kinds of ways of bringing together resources and sharing in those profits in a broader sense in the community, so that it's not a corporate driven model. And there are a lot of folks in New York working toward that, but there are a lot of headwinds because you have a lot of larger players here working in the old model. So there's a struggle against those two different visions.
Cooperatives are mentioned in the Marijuana Regulation Taxation Act, right? But yet to come into being.
The actual regulations don't exist yet. The opportunity for folks to create cooperative businesses that aren't necessarily plant touching or collectives or organizations that come together to share resources that aren't TPI or persons of interest for. I don't want to go into the TPI language and all that, but basically there are ways to come together as cannabis or agricultural businesses that don't require a license from OCM, which is specific to the actual working with the plant, processing the plant, and selling the plant at retail. So it's very specific. So there are ways to come together and work in those ways. But hopefully, when I left, the co-op language was still sitting there ready to be worked on. There are various other pieces. The other thing people don't understand too is OCM, the crew that is there to work on some of this stuff is very small and overtaxed in terms of what they're, required to do. So it's incumbent on the community to kind of push that as well. Pressure from the outside, not, a gentle pressure, but consistent around why we need these things is really important.
Right. Now, in the end, this is all about a consumable product, right? So how do all these practices affect the quality, the safety of the end product?
Well, that's a topic for a whole podcast, Herb, but
we'll come back later.
Okay. Well, there's a few things. And as you know, one of my main pieces of work right now is working around a regenerative certification for growers, because there's a community of folks that believe that, sun-grown, regenerative organic production brings to the plant a whole different set of conditions, and the outcome of that in terms of your flower and products is wholly different than indoor produced. Now, there's a whole debate about what's better, what's not better. That kind of doesn't even matter to some extent. Ultimately, in a consumer market, it's what people are buying. What people are buying is based on their understanding of the the plant, the process. But it's also there's so many kind of cultural nuances around this that it's very hard to boil it all down. But one of the things you get from regenerative production is which can support the viability of businesses long term, is much lower inputs ultimately once you get your system set up. Very low environmental impact, and in fact, if it's truly regenerative, it will be regenerating soil health, sequestering carbon, doing other positive things. That's why it's called regenerative, not a degenerative system. So you have that. So for me, the distinction is around a model of agricultural production that is doing all the things we need businesses to do now, which is regenerate. Whatever positive things we can put back into the world right now are super important. Indoor, large scale tends to be very extractive, so it has a huge impact. So I think one of the things that's going to play out over the next few years in the New York market is carving out those distinctions, making the supply chain less opaque, much more transparent. One of my disappointments as I went around, visiting dispensaries around the state and as part of my job, talking with bud tenders, I was really trying to get a sense of how much they understood about the supply chains to better support growers to be able to transmit that information to dispensaries. So in general, with very few exceptions, most of the folks who were doing the retail, person-to-person communication, had very little understanding of how the plant was grown, who actually grew it, though they knew a farm, but they didn't know where it was or who the people were or other kinds of things. So it's all of those nuances that I think make a product stand out, rather than just being a brand or,
But it is incumbent also on the cultivator. One of our guests last year was William Levy, who I visited a dispensary with him in Brooklyn, and he had the bud tenders in the back, and he went through his whole process, talked about his philosophy, talked about the products that he was delivering to the store. So he really did a great job of informing the bud tenders of the origin of his products.
Yeah, and Will is literally my neighbor, so I know Will quite well. He comes out of organic vegetable production as well, so he's keenly interested in having people connect with the story of what they're consuming. And there quite a few growers. I'm more in touch with that community just by virtue of being interested in it, but around the state, that are doing the same thing. I just talked with one who was in the city the last 2 days doing bud tender training. And that's exactly what he was talking about. The getting to the nuances of the story of that flower.
So my question was about the quality, right? Mm-hmm. So you're a longtime expert. The quality of the New York grown plant.
I think it's all over the place. There is amazing outdoor grown, regeneratively grown flower in New York. There's extremely mediocre. And again, this is the caveat that quality means different things to different people. Mm-hmm. So, and because we're still in a very unnuanced kind of market in a lot of ways, a lot of people equate high THC with quality, and so the high THC and price are still the determining factors. That will change over time, but it's boiled down to that. So to some degree, people think that's quality. A lot of it, like other agricultural pieces, are defined by, what they call bag appeal, or the way it looks, the way it smells, the density of the bud, those kinds of things. A lot of what people understand and know as quality comes out of indoor production. So it looks, smells, tastes in a certain way. And if they're introduced to outdoor flower, which they were always told is kind of dirtweed or, not high quality, there's a lack of understanding there. But what we're discovering is that when you introduce something to somebody just as, hey, this is something amazing, try it out. They want to know about it. And it's like, yeah, this was grown outdoors. It's these cultivars, it has these special characteristics. So I think the quality in New York is all over the place. There's really interesting cultivars that I think are going to come out of the legacy, small scale indoor producers that I've seen around the state the last few years that don't exist anywhere else. They're so niche. They're like only grown by two people in, Rochester or whatever. Their local market knows it, understands it, and will keep supporting it. So that to me, in terms of the quality, is the most interesting piece of it. But I think, the quality, that's another whole podcast, but talking about the quality, what's good for one person is not for another, like any other kind of product.
Yeah, I appreciate the honesty there.
Yeah.
You're no longer at OCM. So any parting words to the agency, the governor, the legislature?
Well, a few things. I mean, I really enjoyed working with the social and economic equity team. Everybody there was, as I said, so dedicated to the work. And that spurred me on when I got kind of depressed about what we could and couldn't do. I would say in general, beyond that, what I understand now, and, it's kind of a weird gift in a certain way, is my understanding of how state politics works for real.
This is the first state job.
Yeah, this is the first, I was 3 years in a state structure, and I'm someone who, chafes at large bureaucratic structures anyway. So I would say my takeaway there, and my parting words are, don't let the bureaucracy, the business as usual within the bureaucracy take over what OCM does. OCM has to get even more creative, and it's very hard for states, as you know, to think outside of the box programmatically. And in terms of regulation, though, I think the next year or two, the community is going to be pushing for things that I think can be done within the current context, but the community really has to push. And OCM, frankly, has to get more creative about the way it's dealing with some of these issues. And that does require breaking out of a certain kind of bureaucratic framework, and that's rough. Even if you're wanting to do that as a state employee within a structure, sometimes it's just impossible. You can't do it, as you know. It's just like the structure doesn't allow for a certain level of nimbleness and creativity. But I think the potential's still there. I will say that as the final.
So where can people find out more about the work that you did, the work that you're going to be doing, and also invite people to the Red Trail Cafe? I have to get up there myself.
Yeah. Okay. So what I've pivoted to is kind of back to the farm here, which I've let go the last few years. My wife and I started an on-farm cafe and wood-fired pizza oven right on a rail trail that runs, bike hike trail that runs right through the middle of our farm. So that's going into its 12th year. which apparently is good. If you make it past 5 years as a business, you're, doing okay. So, and the community that supports us is getting bigger all the time. So I've had to pivot back to that. So I'm actually, putting a lot of energy into that, getting some of our fields back in shape to do more vegetable production for market as well. So that's part of my life. The other part is trying to work to create a collective organization for these regenerative growers to do a couple of things. One is to combine resources and knowledge, work towards marketing in a broader way regeneratively owned or grown, sun-grown cannabis. And that'll take a number of different forums. I'll be, reaching out to folks and announcing more details of that in the next month or so. But we're working with a really good group of people. We're meeting with growers who are kind of already on that path, to work with them to be certified and to work collectively this year. So that's something I'm working on a lot. It's something I've been doing, for many years already. Doing that. If people want to get in touch with me, I am on LinkedIn, and I'm going to try and post some cannabis and ag related things on there. They can also reach out to me at Farmers Table Consulting at Gmail if you want to put that in the show notes. I am already taxed in terms of the amount of extra consulting work I'm going to do. I have to be really careful, but reach out. I'm happy to answer questions or give people opinions about certain things, even though I might not be able to, work with them in a deeper way. I'm always happy to, share that to whatever extent I can, because there is a lot of need. Later in the year, I may be doing some workshops and other things around compliance for growers in particular. And I'm really concerned for, the group that you talked about earlier, the folks transitioning from the legacy market into this regulated space, trying to help them with the structures they're going to need to make that all work and be compliant. So that's what I'm going to be working on, among other things.
Well, thank you. And thank you for taking the chance and joining us at OCM.
Of course.
The work you did while you were there, and
you too.
With this on what comes next.
Yeah. Thanks, Herb. I really appreciate it. And we'll talk again soon.
That's it for this episode of Joint Session Diverse Voices in New York State Cannabis. If you found today's discussion valuable, consider leaving a rating and review on your favorite podcast platform. It helps more listeners find the show. Better yet, share it with colleagues, advocates, and anyone interested in the future of cannabis in New York. Joint Session is produced by me, Herb Barbot, together with executive producer Robert Curtis from SimLab Media. Special thanks as always to Cannabis Wire. You can follow us on Instagram at jointsession.pod and on LinkedIn at Joint Session Podcast. If you have any comments, questions, or topic suggestions, reach out to me at herb.jointsession@gmail.com. Until next time, this is Herb Barbot. Thanks for listening.